The document we've delivered includes concerns of the United States and our allies and partners about Russia's actions that undermine security, a principled and pragmatic evaluation of the concerns that Russia has raised, and our own proposals for areas where we may be able to find common ground. We make clear that there are core principles that we are committed to uphold and defend, including Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the right of states to choose their own security arrangements and alliances.
All right, you just heard the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirming what Russian media reported earlier, that they have delivered that in writing that response to Russia's demands for an overhaul of Eastern Europe's security architecture. In the same breath, Antony Blinken urging U.S. citizens in Ukraine to leave. He talked up points where Moscow and Washington could find common ground, but also pointing to facts on the ground. A massive troop buildup, threats of retaliation by Moscow, and cyber attacks that the Kremlin denies are its doing. In the eye of the storm is Ukraine, whose president is calling on citizens not to panic. As the Ukrainian president plays down the menace of that massive Russian troop buildup at the border, he's accentuating the positive that's taking place this Wednesday right here in Paris, the first meeting in more than 2 years of the so-called Normandy format, four-way talks that bring together France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. What can dialogue achieve at this stage? The talks are a reminder that Ukraine's already lost its territorial integrity back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and supported the insurgency that's raged since in the southeast. And whether you're in Paris, Washington, Kiev, or elsewhere, there's still that question: what does Moscow want this time today? We're looking at Ukraine being in the middle. With us from Warsaw is Maria Zolkina, political analyst at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thank you for being with us here in this special edition of the France 24 debate.
Hello, thank you for invitation.
From Berlin, Henning Hoff, executive editor at International Politik Quarterly. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good evening.
From Washington, Liana Fix, resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund think tank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Monitoring for us those talks that are taking place here in Paris is Armin Georgian. They're running, 3 hours late so far?
Yeah, at least, I think, 3 hours and counting now.
All right, so they're still talking here in Paris. The France 24 debate, where you can always react on the hashtag F24debate. Before we go to our panel, though, let's go to Washington, D.C. White House correspondent Ketevan Gorjestani has been listening in to Antony Blinken's press conference, and he basically promised Ketevan there would be no surprises, but leaving the door open. It sounds like a last-ditch effort.
Yes, you're seeing a sort of a balancing act from the Biden administration when it comes to Russia. They keep repeating, as we heard Tony Blinken in these remarks, saying that they're still hoping that diplomacy is going to work, that they're still leaving the door open for Russia to take the diplomatic path, and that is their responsibility, is to go for the diplomatic way. But when you see all the announcements that have been happening in the past few days, the actions of the United States really show that they are preparing for an imminent attack. And they've even acknowledged it, saying that it really looked like Russia was not showing any signs of de-escalation, and that they were also had the responsibility to be prepared for all scenarios. So you have the discussions and the preparation of the sanctions. Joe Biden saying that he's now considering possible sanctions on Vladimir Putin himself. You have the evacuation of some members of that embassy in Kiev. You have the troops here in the United States on heightened alert for deployment. But what Antony Blinken said really was confirming the message that they've been putting out there publicly, and that was put into writing really today for the Russians to read, which is there are things that are off the table. The US will not agree to ban Ukraine, for example, from ever joining NATO in the future. They also won't agree to removing all US or NATO forces from Eastern Europe. However, he reiterated the areas in which there could be some agreement found with the Russians. For example, the scale and scope of military exercises on that eastern flank. But he insisted once again, which is the message that we've been hearing from the Biden administration for weeks now, it is Russia's decision to make. The ball is in Russia's court. Choose the diplomatic way or face the consequences.
Ketevan Gorgistani in Washington, many thanks. Nick Holdsworth is our correspondent in Moscow. Nick, is there enough in what you heard from Antony Blinken for the Kremlin to be able to somehow declare victory and de-escalate?
That's really hard to say at this point. Basically, the Secretary of State is saying that the US position hasn't changed. The Russians know what the red lines are for Washington, that there are non-negotiable aspects of those 8 points the Russians put to NATO and to the White House, and that the ball is now in the Russians' court. It all depends whether Vladimir Putin can see some face-saving manoeuvre in a Russian response short of getting all that he demanded. However, that said, his foreign minister...
I was going to say that there might be an early indication of how much goodwill there is between the former Cold War superpowers, because we heard Blinken ask the Russians not to make public that written response, to leave it for the diplomats.
Yeah, that's already been discussed today. In his comments to the Russian parliament earlier today, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said very, very clearly that the Americans had requested that they not publish the written responses in full, and he said that Russia would respect that. However, it was incumbent upon Moscow to publish some kind of shorter version of it, perhaps not in full, but to give assurances to the Russian public, to reassure Russians, reassure people around the world. Lavrov is a consummate professional. He's probably the ace in the pack that Vladimir Putin has, because Sergei Lavrov has been around a long time. He's very well known on the diplomatic circuit. He's respected. He's a likable character. He's very professional. And actually, I would go so far as to say that Lavrov represents Russia's interests, not strictly speaking just Putin's interests. He's been around an awful long time, and he certainly knows how to deal with the American side. I would say that Lavrov's response, given what he's said so far, given what I know about the man, having met him on a couple of occasions, will be very measured, and the Russians will look for every single possible way to respect the American side if they can save face by doing so and get some of what they want. They threw a lot of stuff into those demands, knowing that a lot of it would be thrown out from the word go anyway.
Nick Holdsworth in Moscow, many thanks for that immediate reaction there to the announcement made by the U.S. Secretary of State. Maria Zolkina, what's your feeling after listening to Antony Blinken?
So my feeling is that there is no space for compromise as of now between Russia and US on the other hand, but at the same time, so none of the sides in this negotiation process are ready to stop it or to frozen it. Moreover, I have to say that the US, despite insisting on pretty seriously insisting on the fact that they do not want to compromise about the collective security issues, about the choice who is gonna join NATO and what US themselves are gonna do in the eastern partners of NATO in Europe. Nevertheless, so US and other Western European partners, while talking to Russia, have to insist that until Russia de-escalate at least to some extent along the Russian and Ukrainian border, no progress in negotiations is possible. And this is actually from what Biden started negotiations with Putin in December 2021. But as of now, we have seen that the role of these negotiations is on its way. But at the same time, Russia just tried to hit the tension between the West and itself without any kind of de-escalation on our borders.
So you're saying that the U.S. is already going soft?
Not going soft, but I would say that for reaching any compromise with Russia or for reaching any kind of decision, there should be certain diplomatic and political circumstances, conditions for that, preconditions, I would say. And the main precondition is to make Russia show the willingness to de-escalate currently situation, because since beginning of January, Russia continues to gather more and more military equipment and people from military staff along Ukraine and Russia borders. And at the same time, so what progress or what decisions can be actually achieved and made with a negotiation format if there is no signs for de-escalation from military perspective?
Henning Hoff, do you see any possibility for any kind of progress? Do you see, for instance, the Russians agreeing to pull back some of their troops?
I think that they will not pull back.
Let me put the question to Henning Hoff, please.
Excuse me?
Really undecided at the moment. I think, as the Secretary of State said, the borders in Russia's court. We all have to see and wait what actually Vladimir Putin decides. But I think overall the picture is not all bad. The West, so the United States, the European allies, have been able to organize themselves and come up with a convincing counter strategy. I think my Polish colleague is right insofar as NATO and the US and also the Europeans have sort of met Russia on their turf. That sort of the response so far has taken all the demands by Moscow sort of at face value and have not sort of made many counter demands. This is now changing, I think, with what we heard from Antony Blinken right there, and so we get more of a sort of more balanced discussion that the West, the United States, Europe, NATO also sort of start formulating their demands vis-a-vis Moscow. And I think we are sort of in a way are entering a new stage. But as I said earlier, all eyes are on Moscow now.
All eyes are on Moscow now. They're a little bit on Paris, Armin Georgian. After all, there is this meeting of the so-called Normandy format. I know it's not a high-level meeting, but there is this sense that it's, among some, that this is, well, I guess we could call it a two-ring circus, because there's the problems of Ukraine and there's the broader problems of Eastern Europe that are on the table here. When it comes to this Normandy format, it's things like prisoner exchanges, it's things like what status for citizens in the southeast of the country. All this was supposed to be dealt with in regular meetings ever since 2015. They haven't met in over 2 years. They're meeting today. You can't help wondering, the fact that the U.S. hands that written response, is it a coincidence that it's happening the same day that there are talks going on in Paris?
Well, I think the French and the Germans, you know, they've throughout this whole Normandy process have tried to have a slightly sort of independent line from the US. So that's I think that the agenda that certainly Macron is.
But do you think it was orchestrated between the Americans and the French and the Germans? The fact that the U.S. ambassador to Moscow goes with the document today.
Well, I haven't heard any suggestion to that effect, Francois, but obviously there is an element of, you know, the US sort of submitting this tough letter while the Europeans say, well, you know, we can still talk and we can continue the diplomacy. But I don't know how, you know, how realistic these proposals are at this stage, the ones that you mentioned. You know, prisoner exchanges, the humanitarian measures, and ultimately political talks between the separatist leaders or pro-Russia forces, whatever you want to call them, in the east of Ukraine and the government in Kiev, and certainly a very senior Ukrainian official, I forget which one it was, but our correspondent in Kiev was telling us about this earlier. He posted on Facebook this morning saying that talks with separatists were a non-starter in the current circumstances. So I'm not really sure what to make of this, because on the other hand, if you look at what the Ukrainian representative to the Normandy format tweeted this morning, he actually sounded quite positive. He said, we have finally managed to unlock the format, and it's a strong signal of readiness for a peaceful settlement. Plus the fact that they're very late. They're more than 3 hours late now. So
they're still talking.
They're still talking. That obviously means there's still something that they're trying to hammer out.
And we'll see if one meeting begets another. This question of whether or not the allies are all on the same page is always going to be a challenge. Russia's just one nation, whereas the NATO alliance is many nations. And as the drums of war beat louder, it's Germany that's been coming under increased pressure from allies for refusing to export arms to Ukraine, particularly after the Chancellor dodged the question 3 times during a joint Tuesday press conference in Berlin with the French president. Now, though, Olaf Scholz has committed 5,000 helmets. Ukraine's ambassador to Germany expressing thanks, but describing the pledge as purely a symbolic gesture. The mayor of Kiev and former world heavyweight boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko telling Bild newspaper it is a joke. Liana Fix, Klitschko saying the behavior of the German government leaves me speechless. Does it leave you speechless?
Well, what leaves me speechless is certainly the underwhelming performance of Berlin in the last week, because we had a flurry of news which came out and which made the new Berlin government look quite weak and unexperienced in pursuing this crisis management. But let's at this point not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Germany is a reliable ally within the alliance, and Germany has shifted already on Nord Stream 2. So there is a joint and agreed position that Nord Stream 2 is on the table as part of the deterrence and sanctions package towards Russia if something happens. That has been reaffirmed despite divergent voices in the last weeks. Germany is part of the efforts to put up a strong sanctions package towards Russia. And the question of weapon deliveries is really a question which is not easy for Germany domestically to discuss, because it is perceived as contributing to escalation. But if that remains the case and Germany does not want to contribute defensive weapons to Ukraine, it has to find another way of showing that it is reliable and that its Eastern allies can count on Germany, such as sending support to Eastern allies. Germany already leads a NATO battalion in Lithuania and could increase these efforts to show that it is on the side of Eastern allies and on the side of Ukraine too.
All right, speaking in Berlin, the visiting UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace saying we're not judging countries who choose not to provide lethal aid to Ukraine. Henninghoff, just briefly on this point, I mean, it's true, Germany, it is a domestic concern not to want to pour fuel on the fire by sending weapons. But then again, it's got, like France, a booming arms industry and exports lots of weapons to lots of other places.
Yes, that's true. But the tradition in German foreign policy has been this line which is coming under attack in this precise situation. The government really has difficulty in explaining these kind of stances. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign secretary, said that's due to German history, but that doesn't make that much sense if you consider German history playing out, or the dark side of German history playing out in Ukraine in particular. And also this argument sort of that weapons deliveries would make the situation worse. You can make a very good counter argument, saying no, it increases the likelihood that deterrence actually will work. But for now, this is the government line, and I think as the British Defence Minister said, it's, I think, for an alliance with different kind of traditions and policies in place, it is not a sort of cut catastrophic failure on the part of the German government not to deliver arms at this moment. And I think for everyone, it might be a good moment to calm down a little bit and not play Putin's game and sort of criticizing each other all the time.
Would it have been,
Henning,
tell it to us straight here, would it have been a better idea to just not give anything at all than to give 5,000 helmets?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a question also. I think we are sort of falling a little bit for some sort of internal play. What's going on? I mean, I think the Ukrainians already do not longer sort of expect Germany to send any weapons, and I think the helmets were requested. So it's a good thing on balance that Ukraine gets these helmets, and so I find it a little sort of. I think we can't have it both ways, I understand that France, for instance, wasn't asked by Kiev for any weapons deliveries, and there's also sort of an element of sort of trying to tease out Germany to make a stronger case, where so far Berlin has been, and I agree with Liana on that topic. Diplomacy, especially public diplomacy, hasn't been that great. But so the fundamentals are there, and I wouldn't exclude, if Russia were to act aggressively against Ukraine, that the German government actually will change its policies on arms delivery. And this is something which we'll have to see, but I wouldn't exclude that at all.
All right, the optics of the helmet pledge don't look great, but then again, neither does a video call between Vladimir Putin and the Italian Chamber of Commerce that took place earlier. The Russian president praising Italy as one of our leading economic partners. The government in Rome says it's embarrassed privately and terms it, by the way, a private event. Maria Zalkina, your thoughts on that meeting between Putin and the Italian Chamber of Commerce? Is that just a sideshow? Is it irrelevant?
I think that, of course, yes, there is partially part of informational, external foreign policy of Russia, so informational support to all the political steps of Russia to show that Russia is an equal partner and is important and considered to be important by many European countries, especially the old member states from the European Union. This is something very logical to Russia and something we always expect from them. So yes. But at the same time, so for them, it's very important now, at least what we see from Ukrainian perspective, to try to divide somehow politically, symbolically, diplomatically, sometimes economically, try to divide Western community. And if Russian president and as well as, let's say, Moscow in general, tries to show that relations with specific bodies or specific politicians in certain European countries are rather warm in comparison to others, it will try, due to Russian propaganda, show that this is like a different opinions in Europe and Europe is not united. And this is one of the milestones for informational support for everything Russia does in Europe and in the world generally. So yes, I think this is part of this concrete informational support for external political actions.
Yeah, the Atlantic Alliance, which seems to have come together since last week's off-the-cuff comment by the U.S. president, or we assume it was off-the-cuff, talking about minor incursions, an eventual minor incursion by Russia, and what that would be like. Joe Biden changing tack when he was speaking with reporters on Tuesday.
We have no intention of putting American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine. But as I said, there are going to be serious economic consequences if he moves.
Can you tell me whether you think, sir, that the risk of an invasion is increasing or decreasing or steady just as it has been these recent days?
I'll be completely honest with you. It's a little bit like reading tea leaves. This would be the largest, if he were to move in with all those forces, it would be the largest invasion since World War II.
Liana Fix, what does Biden mean when he talks about World War II?
Well, I think Biden's foreign policy team was certainly not happy with these comments that he made because they went off the official script. Later, he also talked about the possibility of a minor incursion in contrast to a major incursion. So there we saw the president speaking a little bit more freely. But the message that it sent was pretty clear that at the moment it really is difficult to say what the Kremlin will do, and that perhaps the Kremlin itself has not already taken this decision. But there is in Europe and in the United States a very clear stance that NATO will not become involved in a military conflict with troops on the ground. So there's consensus on this. So if we look at Putin's talk with Italian business leaders, we might also see it from a positive side that the Russian government is actually nervous about the sanctions scenario that has been built up and tries to talk to the business community to raise attention to the costs of sanctions. So some of the policy that Biden pursues seems to be working, and the other part of the policy of deterrence, and the other part of it, the policy of dialogue, is what we see today in Paris, with everyone just trying to keep talking with the Russian side than having a military escalation.
Yeah, and we're watching live images as we speak, Liana, of the Secretary General of NATO, who's briefing reporters and confirming that, as well as the United States, the Atlantic Alliance itself has delivered its written response to Russia's demands. That's coming out now. You were mentioning there how the Russian president's been talking business in Italy. He's also been planning for war in Ukraine. And as to what Vladimir Putin's true intentions are, you heard Joe Biden say he doesn't want to read the tea leaves. The French president on Tuesday in Berlin informing his opinion based on facts on the ground. Let's listen to Emmanuel Macron.
It is not up to me to say what final objective Russia is pursuing, but I can observe that there is currently a multiplication of destabilization actions against several sovereign states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. And that, along with those destabilization actions, there is an increasingly hybrid Russian approach.
Maria Zalkina, this is the same French president who, in a speech before the European Parliament last week, talked about Europe forging its own path in its relationship with Russia. Your thoughts on what we heard Tuesday?
I think that as of now, so one of the weakest, let's say, places in not only maybe French political perception of the situation, but let's say from collective West, if I may say so, is that there is no strict definition what should be considered as an aggression on the side of Russia. And here, I think that Russian government will try to play with it. Because if we speak about different scenarios, if a French president and German politicians are having no 100% consensus with their counterparts on the other side of Atlantic, so what to be considered an aggression enough, to launch the strongest possible sanctions? I think that this is the way how Russia tries now actually to play, because what is perceived as a normal political dialogue by the Western politicians from the Western democratic countries is treated like a weakness by the authoritarian political regime in Russia. And while until Russia does not have a strict signal that any kind of hybrid aggression, not only full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, will be treated as the basis for strongest possible sanctions, until that time, so Russia will uses actually adherence of the Western countries, including France, to the dialogue as their weakness, actually.
And now we're getting into the scenarios which could unfold. Ukraine and its allies fearing a so-called false flag operation, kind of like a hidden attack against its own interest to offer a pretext. Russia's ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, raising that specter when last week he said, quote, "We won't tolerate it if they attack our citizens." Konstantin Gavrilov, who, by the way, added that only dogs bark, a wolf bites, and that is it. When he suddenly lifts that warning, Maria, of don't attack our citizens, is he giving away what the game plan is?
So the most possible actually scenario which we expect from what we know on the ground in Ukraine is that Russia will try on the one hand to create the most aggressive surrounding as it can, but at the same time to omit the maximum of sanctions, let's say, because if Russia tries simply to invade from its own territory with the land operation or with air operation, it will be simply obvious for everyone who is guilty for that. That's why we are much more concentrating on the possibility of another scenario when Russia will use the platform of occupied Donbass in order to highly escalate the tensions on the ground there, to highly escalate shootings and everything, and try to occupy some new territories of the Donbass controlled now by Ukrainian government, will support it with the cyber attacks against Ukrainian different facilities and official bodies, electronic system, try to attack some critical infrastructure, and maybe organize some provocations in other regions, especially those bordering with Belarus, because Belarus, though being politically dependent on Russia as of now, is still a separate state from the international law point of view. And if something happens on the border between Ukraine and Belarus, it will be again, not on the flag of Russia, but Russia will reach its goals for destabilization of Ukraine due to this provocation.
Yeah, there's been this steady diet of muscle flexing. The latest example, the Defense Ministry in Moscow this Wednesday putting out images of Black Sea naval drills. Since last week, as you were saying, Maria, Ukraine now has forces on 3 sides surrounding it, and there have been fresh images as well of those joint maneuvers inside Belarus. Belarus, whose leader is only happy to oblige.
Что касается сегодня гвалт, учения.
As for the buzz around the drills, these drills have coincided with deployment of Belarusian armed forces in the south. I was forced to do it because the situation on the border with Ukraine is not better than it is on the border with Poland. Hundreds of cases of arms trafficking have been prevented, and just one of them was from Russia. All the weapons and ammunition were coming from Ukraine.
So Henning Hoff, you heard earlier our Moscow correspondent talk about Sergei Lavrov. Would you say that Lavrov is good cop and Alexander Lukashenko is bad cop?
Well, I think what maybe sort of is the connecting bridge between the two is that they sort of both probably don't know what Putin will decide. I mean, if you hear sort of Russian diplomats or also sort of those who are very closely aligned with President Putin, like President Lukashenko, who sort of is illegitimate from the point of the EU. They are guessing themselves. That is at least my reading of the situation. So we simply don't know.
And do you agree with Maria Zolkina that the biggest worry right now is to Kiev's north with those joint exercises, as they're being called, taking place across the border?
Maybe, but I think the scenarios she sort of developed very clearly here would already constitute a situation where the West would answer those with severe sanctions. I don't see how that could not be the case. So I'm actually not too worried. I mean, of course, we can make sort of we play Putin's game in a way and sort of break in sort of our little heads about what could possibly be the most likely scenario. But most of these scenarios, almost every one of them, would constitute this breach which the German government, the United States government, the French government and all allies have sort of identified as the moment where sanctions would be put in place. And so I think in a way this is a little artificial. I wouldn't also not expect a full land operation which would sort of conquer Ukraine up to the Dnieper River. that still looks very unlikely. But in between, there are, of course, a number of hybrid and other scenarios. But you wonder what would be the point of those. And as I said, I have no doubt that these kind of actions, false flag, whatever. I mean, we are used to this Russian playbook now. I think to claim that this has nothing to do with Russia is very, very, very difficult to believe. And so I think there's not that much to worry about these sort of very different situations.
Liana Fix, do you agree?
Well, I think what is interesting, and that's what we see in Belarus, is that for the first time we see Russian military troops in Belarus. And the reason, obviously, and that's also the reason for Lukashenko's statement that he just made, is that Lukashenko has become entirely dependent because it was basically Moscow, which is the main reason that Lukashenko is still in power after the revolution in Minsk and in the entirety of Belarus. So here we have Belarus, which will do whatever Moscow tells it to do. Then, on the other hand, we had discussions in the Duma on the possibility of accepting an independence of the so-called People's Republic in the Donbass. This discussion has been shelved right now, but it points to one further scenario, which could be similar to the Georgia 2008 scenario, that those areas will be accepted by Russia as independent, and then Russian troops will officially come in, and Russia will have, for a really long time, as in other conflicts in the region, a lever to have control over Ukraine. But there are also other scenarios that we could easily imagine, which would certainly trigger a sanctions response. But by that point, we are already too late. There would already be Russian troops in Ukraine. So the question at the moment really is, how can we prevent and how can we design the sanction scenario in a way that deters Moscow from taking this step? I mean, another possibility would be Moscow coming into Ukraine and trying to divide it in half or to install a puppet government in Kiev. There are different scenarios that could be possible with the military buildup that we see right now. And what we have to achieve is to prevent these scenarios coming into place. Because, again, if they do come into place, we will see crippling sanctions. But then again, it will be too late, because then Kiev and Ukraine will have to find an arrangement and basically capitulate towards Moscow.
Armin Georgian?
Yeah, I think no one's mentioned one point in this whole puzzle, which is that, since Viktor Yanukovych fell from power, the Kremlin has not had someone in Kiev who will make sure that Ukraine doesn't apply to join NATO. And I'm not sure that, hybrid warfare or, so-called limited operations, any of those things really get the Kremlin any closer to that goal of having a government in Kiev that will not apply for NATO membership. But equally, this maximum decapitation strategy that British intelligence referred to, that doesn't seem entirely feasible either. Of course, we can't rule anything out, but I'm just not sure that what our colleagues just said now about, perhaps doing something in the East and even perhaps accepting the independence of those regions, how does that deal with this fundamental problem which the Kremlin has, that it sees, which is goes to the core of this letter, doesn't it, that Antony Blinken has just handed in, which is NATO has an open door, it will always be open. What fundamentally, in the long term, does the Kremlin do about that? And any of the scenarios that we've been speculating on tonight, I don't think really bring us any closer.
Can't back down?
I'm not sure he can back down, but I also don't know how he achieves that long-term core objective of stopping Ukraine one day joining NATO if it wants to.
Before we go, Maria Zalkina, there's one person we haven't perhaps spoken about, which is the president of Ukraine himself, Volodymyr Zelensky, a former stand-up comedian. who's been thrust into a crisis situation. He's been second-guessed over the past couple of weeks, most notably over the fight that's been brewing between him and his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko. How is he doing, though, in the face of this pressure, these 105,000 plus troops on his border?
So official position of the office of the president is to be calm and get ready. And from this point of view, I would say that warnings which are coming from US president, from Great Britain prime minister, from other Western European countries leaders, they sometimes even much, stronger about risks we are facing right now. I mean, Ukraine is facing right now than the official statements made by Ukrainian president. But at the same time, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs is trying to keep Ukraine by the table of international negotiations, because this is one of the most important challenges for us, not, to be put aside of international negotiations, touching directly not only European collective security, but Ukraine's future and Ukraine's sovereignty itself. And on the other hand, Ukraine has to continue domestic work on how to raise our capacities. We don't need anyone to fight in case of any kind of hybrid or full-fledged invasion to fight for us in terms of people on our land, but we need just new technologies and weapons. And that's why, for instance, that my colleague has touched the issue with German position. Yes, Germany does not supply anything to Ukraine in terms of weapons and arms and armament, but at the same time, there was almost a political scandal when Germany was blocking supply of the arms to Ukraine and weapons to Ukraine through the specific NATO-related agency. And as of now, for instance, a couple of days ago, two committees of Ukrainian parliament, Committee on European Integration and on Foreign Policy, have appealed officially to their colleagues in Germany, to German parliament, in order to stop, creating any kind of political obstacles for other members of the European Union who are willing to support Ukraine with weapons. We don't need people, we need weapons, and we need some new technologies which we lack. Other thing, Ukraine can domestically prepare itself.
Maria Zolkina, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Warsaw. I want to thank Henning Hoff in Berlin, Liana Fix in Washington, France 24's Armin Georgian monitoring. They're still not done?
No, still not.
All right, those Paris talks and face-to-face talks between Russia and Ukraine still ongoing as we speak. Much more to come here and on our website, france24.com. Thanks for joining us.